story. But I suppose you've already heard the one about Ida. Or haven't you? She was only the saddest, unluckiest little girl who ever lived. You mean to tell me you've never heard? Well, then, that is the story that I shall tell you. It begins a very long time ago, in the town of Catterwall, in the midst of a terrible storm. She simply appeared one day. She was small and pale and shivering, and standing all alone on a corner. A paper around her neck said her name was Ida. Ida wouldn't say anything at all. Oh, how frightened she looked, but oh, how brave she tried to look, until the kindly Mrs. P stopped and inquired as to the whereabouts of her parents. Then Ida cried, and cried, and cried. Well, Mrs. P determined right then and there to bring Ida home with her. She'd read about this sort of thing in her Women's Digest. After all, it was surely the right thing to do. It's only until her parents turn up, Mrs. P said to Mr. P. Well, I couldn't have just left her there. Something awful could have happened to her because I didn't stop, and it would have been very bad luck for us, Henry, I can tell you that. All right, dear, said Mr. P to Mrs. P. Just until her parents turn up. But Ida's parents did not turn up. Mrs. P did not mind, and to tell the truth, neither did Mr. P. Ida was quiet and well behaved. She went to bed when told, kept her toys in order, and tried her very best to help with the household chores. In return, she had a home and a family, and seemingly not a fear in the world. Except, perhaps, for the neighbour's terrier, Petey, who made it quite clear that he wished to bite her ankles. The first sign of trouble came late one afternoon, announced by angry pounding upon the front door. It was Mrs. Pheasant, the P's next-door neighbour. "Where is she?" she screeched. "Where is the little devil?" She claimed that someone, only moments before, had savagely wounded the family dog. "I know it was Ida. I know it was because I looked out of the window the moment I heard Petey, and that girl was in my yard. He's broken his leg, you know, and I'll expect you to pay for his care." The P's were bewildered, of course, but Mrs. Pheasant was known to exaggerate. Ida was too frightened of Petey to cause him such harm, but Petey recovered and Mrs. Pheasant never bothered the P's again. The incident was soon forgotten. The real trouble was much stranger and only beginning. There was the morning in the garden with the horde of black snakes. The Sunday at St. Parsley's, when the baptistry turned to oil. The great bat found in Catterwall Park. And every time something truly bizarre happened, Ida was nearby. It made the more superstitious folk simply buzz with gossip. "That little orphan girl of yours is bad luck," some said. The P's would merely shrug and walk on their way, but even Mrs. P could not deny she sometimes wondered about the quiet little girl. And then tragedy struck. Ida began to wander at night. She never made it very far before someone found her, but she continued to try. One night, Mrs. P decided to follow her. Maybe she's trying to find her mother and father. What if they're alive somewhere? She thought with the tiniest bit of dread, for she secretly hoped the little girl would always live with her, peculiarities aside. So she quietly followed at a distance. Ida wandered and wandered, down the street, through Catterwall Park, past Lake Coriander, beyond the cemetery, between the two school buildings, and all the way to Farmer Clover's field, where she stopped at last before a weathered old barn. Then she did the most peculiar thing. Lifting her tiny arms into the air, she began to sing. What was this about? Mrs. P had never heard Ida sing before. She hadn't even heard the child speak. Mrs. P was so surprised that she nearly forgot they were all the way on the other side of town. Who knew what mischief lay beyond those barn doors at that hour, she thought. Better they return home at once. Careful not to frighten Ida, Mrs. P reached out to take her hand, and then... When Farmer Clover rose for his early morning work, he was startled to find an odd little girl sitting on the grass before his barn. Beside her lay Gladys P. She used to buy eggs from him, didn't she? He thought. But now she lay quite still, barely breathing, her face frozen in terror. Mrs. P was alive, but she would never speak again. Distraught with grief and very much afraid, Mr. P sent Ida away. That day, Ida cried almost as hard as when she'd first been found, all alone on a corner.